Alright, so now we have Visual Studio installed on our computer. So the next step is, let's launch it. So find your Visual Studio icon, might be pinned to your dock. If not, you may want to go to your Start menu and type Visual Studio. I've got multiple versions. I'm going to shoot for Visual Studio 2015. Visual Studio 2015 will launch for you. And the first thing that you may see, depending on if you have previous versions of Visual Studio installed, is that it will come up and ask you, how do you want to configure Visual Studio? And now when that screen pops up, it'll pop up and ask you specifically what kind of information or features do you want. Now this is Visual Studio. I have it pre-existing, but let me jump under Tools here and Import Export, and I'm going to kind of replicate what you'll see. So I'm going to reset all my settings. And I'm going to say no and hit next. So you'll probably see a screen like this when you first start up Visual Studio, and it's going to ask you which collection of settings do you want to use, or how do you want to configure Visual Studio. For all of my lectures, I will be using the Visual C# configuration. Now if you have Visual Studio pre-installed and you want to change those settings, you can follow the steps I just did previously. Tools, Import Export Settings, Reset All Settings, and you can rewind and see all of those. The Visual C# is the settings, the default settings that I'll be using for the remainder of these courses, and those are the presets for where menu items are, keyboard shortcuts, all of those things. If you have a preference and you prefer to use maybe the web development mode or general, as long as you're comfortable with that, I'm okay with that as well. There may be some differences that you'll have to overcome in terms of where things are on the screen or which options may or may not appear when you right click. But if you're comfortable with working through those, I'm okay with that too. But for me, I'm going to be using Visual C#. So I'm going to go ahead and hit finish, and it's going to go ahead and set up all my settings. Since I've never changed any of them, nothing's really changed. So we're now inside of Visual Studio. We can start off by creating our first project. To do that, we'll go under Start here. We'll see New Project. If we have an existing project we want to open, we can do Open Project. If we have a project from Source Control that we want to open, we can say Open from Source Control. We'll talk about more about that in a little bit. Any recent projects that we've opened will be listed below. As you can see, there's some projects that I've been working on. But I'm going to go ahead and go New Project. Now, clicking New Project here is the same steps as if I went File, New, File, New, and chose Project. Same steps, it's just one click here instead of, 3 clicks there. So I click New Project. Visual Studio will pop up the New Project dialog window. It'll probably look something like this, where C# is selected, and I've got all of my Visual Studio projects listed here for me. Now, there are different projects here to choose from. We have Windows Form Applications, WPF or Windows Presentation Foundation applications, console apps, ASP.NET Web apps, different things like shared apps, class libraries, console application packages, additional class library projects, Silverlight, and the list goes on and on. So we will choose the type of project that we want to use for our development based off of these options. Now there's a lot of options listed here. If we're looking at too many options, you can either click on Windows for just Windows-based apps, Web for web-based projects. Obviously there's Office and SharePoint integrations you can build. I have the third-party tools for doing mobile development, so there's my Android template, Azure SDK development, extensibility, iOS, light switch, and so on. So lots of choices here in terms of development options. So let's just start out with a Visual C# and click on Console Application, and let's create a console app. So the first console app that I want to create is going to be My First Console App. So that's the name that I've given it. The location where that project is saved for me is the default. So it's Users, my username, Documents, Visual Studio 2015/projects. So that's where I'm going to find my project called My First Console App. I'm going to go ahead and actually highlight this location and copy it to my clipboard. And then I'm going to show you how to get to that later. So then we'll also see under solution name, it says My First Console App. We'll want to leave that. We want to create a directory for our solution, and it asks if we want to create a new Git repository. For now, I'm going to uncheck that, but we'll want that checked later as we go through the development of our projects. We'll go ahead and hit OK. And Visual Studio will go through and actually condense and build that project for us. And in front of us now is just a basic command line application. If we look at the landscape of what we're seeing, we have our program, which is our code, right here on the left-hand side of our screen. We have our using statements, namespace, our program class, and then a static method called main. We have a toolbox here on the left-hand side which has different tools, and depending on what type of app you're in and what you're working on, different tools may appear here. It's very dynamic and context-based. On the right-hand side, we have the Solution Explorer. Now, you can think of this as kind of like your File Explorer, but it's in the context of your project or your solution. So when you think of a hierarchy, we have a solution at the very top. That solution holds multiple projects, and each one of those projects compiles into either a DLL or an exe file. Inside of that project, that's where basically all of our documents live. Now, for our console application, it's very simple, straightforward. We have a program.cs, which is our launch point for our application, and then we have an app.config. We have references, which are additional libraries that we can pull into our application to give it additional functionality. And then we have properties, which is basically just the compiler information that we need for our app. So solution, project, and then project file contents, which are actually documents that are part of our project. So this program.cs is the file, and then on the left-hand side here is the contents of that file. Down below, we have a properties dialog box, and that has different properties. These properties typically are reflective of the item that we're looking at up here in the Solution Explorer. But if we have a drag and drop interface here on the right-hand or on the left-hand side, when you click on an item here, you'll see special properties about the item selected. You'll notice that I changed my selection from program.cs. There's my C# file. I clicked on the app config, and my left-hand side refreshed, showing me the contents of that app config. So there's some dynamic kind of preview or peeking that occurs when you click on different files in the Solution Explorer. And we can talk more about that in later sessions. So that is kind of the 30,000-foot view of Visual Studio. Obviously, as we get into the tool, you'll learn more about its functionality and how it pertains to the applications that you're building.